I'm very grateful this morning that I am here again. Sometimes when someone asks me to speak now, I tell them if I'm alive, I'll try to be there. But I'm so grateful that Dorothy was able to come with me. And we're always grateful to see you folks. We have a long-time connection with East Hill. It's been a joyful one and a wonderful privilege. And I just love all of you very much and grateful for the work that you're doing for the Lord. Let's read from Mark, the 10th chapter, beginning in verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldst do for us whatsoever we shall desire. And he said unto them, What would ye that I should do for you? And they said unto him, Grant unto us that we may sit, one on the right hand, and the other on the left in thy glory. But Jesus said to them, Ye know not what ye ask. Can you drink of the cup that I drink of? And the baptism that I'm baptized with, can you be baptized? They said unto him, We can. He said, Ye shall indeed drink of the cup that I drink of, and the baptism that I'm baptized with, withal ye shall be baptized. But to grant to sit on my right hand and my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared. Now when the 10 heard this, they began to be much displeased. But Jesus called them unto him and said to them, You know that the Gentiles who are accounted as rulers exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. For whosoever of you will be great among you, let him be your minister, the King James has, slave. And whosoever will be chief of all, whosoever you will be the chiefest, shall be your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to minister, to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Let's look at the text for a moment. It's interesting to me as I read that the question arises, how may I serve you? If I'm going to follow the example the Master just set forth for himself, I need to ask myself that question, how may I serve you? And I know from reading this text that a servant's heart is absolutely essential to ministry. A servant's heart allows that person to put aside his own agenda. It's not his time anymore. It's not his talent anymore. It's not his wish anymore. It all belongs to the Master who said that he would be a servant. The best leaders in the church, in my judgment, are those who are willing to serve. And I can't think of any who would be in a greater position to lead. And notice in the text that Jesus taught this not only to James and John, but he also referred to the other 10 and by extrapolation to us. Now notice what he said there to the 10 again very quickly. You know that those who are regarded as rulers over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. They think they are the bosses of them. And they also exercise authority upon those. But whoever wants to be great among you should be slave of all. Slave of all. I want to draw our attention for a moment to 1 Timothy 3:2. And there's a phrase in this sentence that actually is the description of one Greek word. The phrase in the text there, as far as qualifications of an elder is concerned, is given to hospitality. That's one word in the original, philoxenos. Given to hospitality. In Romans, the 12th chapter, we can read at verse 13, that we are to be lovers of hospitality. And Titus put it in the sense of the use of hospitality, as Peter did, 1 Peter 4:9, Titus 1:8. But that word hospitality is interesting to me because it doesn't mean I invited you home for dinner. That's hospitable, all right, but it really isn't what the word is conveying to us. The lexicographers tell us that philoxenos means something like to use hospitality one to another, whether it's a friend or a stranger. In other words, this person who is hospitable, who is the servant of all, is looking for people who need help. He's seeking out those for whom there is a need. And it is interesting that based on the relationship with Christ, who was the true servant, we're going to have to learn to be given to hospitality. In fact, before a man is appointed an elder, he should have that quality already, of being in the community looking for those who may be hungry or thirsty or naked or whatever it is they need. And the highest compliment that I can give anyone as a believer in God and a Christian is to look for those who need help. You remember at the judgment scene, he said, when I was hungry, you fed me. Thirsty, you gave me to drink. Naked, you clothed me. Sick and in prison, and you visited me. You took care of me, he says. They asked him how it was that they ever did that. They said, we never saw you hungry. He said, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. This one we're serving was first of all a servant. And that's an interesting situation, it seems to me. How may I serve you? The apostles, in my judgment, as I read that text, were confused about the servant nature of Jesus. Did you notice that James and John, there in verse 35, we read, they called him master? You're my master. They called him teacher. They called him Lord. But they didn't call him a servant. And I doubt if they understood at the moment what to make of him as a servant. I think perhaps that was a little bit strange to them. On this side of the cross, as we look back at what he did, we can understand what it means to be a servant and what he meant by that. But how could these disciples be so selfish as to want the best places without doing any of the work? And when we read the text, we get a little bit upset with them, I suppose. But before we're too hard on James and John, as the 10 were, before we're too hard on the 10, let's remember something. We have to examine our own attitudes towards what it means to be a servant. James and John wanted to sit on the right and the left. They wanted to be patted on the back for being his disciples. They wanted places of honor for being his disciples. But I wonder sometimes how often folks in the church hope to be in a place of honor and hope the Lord notices that they did something or did that. Jesus replied to them, you have a cup and you have a baptism. And their response is interesting. They said, we can. If you don't understand how to be a servant yet, how do you understand what it means to be his true follower? He's talking about being put to death. And they said, we can. I know at that point they weren't ready. If you want to be the greatest, you have to be a slave, he said. If you'll run over to Philippians 2 for a moment, you'll read that again about what he did. And Paul started that section with, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, Philippians 2:5. Keith, I want you to have the same mindset that he did. He was in the form of God. He didn't think it was necessary to hold on to that, but he made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant. Why? So he could taste death for all of us. I had the opportunity one time to ask a young person to define humility for me. And she said, it means low self-esteem. Well, we could talk about that for a little while. It's not my lesson. But we need to learn a beautiful truth, that being a servant is the great blessing of Christianity. That's it. And it's the way of the cross. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Dorothy and I have a nephew who has Down syndrome. And his grandmother was trying to teach him one time the concept of upside down, which was hard for him to understand. But he would hold his teddy bear by the foot and say, upside down, and then he'd laugh because he was learning a new concept about upside down. And he had never heard that before. That's upside down. Well, I wonder something. Anything that's upside down, which provoked his laughter, didn't fit the way he understood the word. That's why he was laughing. It was upside down to him. The disciples, when they heard what he said, must have felt like Jeffrey did when he started to learn that word. They thought, this is an upside down master. It doesn't seem right that he's telling us that he has to serve. I don't understand him that way. That defines their common understanding of what it meant to be a master. In their society, it was always somebody's in charge, and then you go on down the line. Same way today. And when they heard him say, I didn't come to be served, that had to be upside down to them. That had to be some kind of strange situation. But if they had thought about it, they lived in a time where social, political, and religious power was understood and structured hierarchically from the top down. And I think sometimes that's the way we think of the church, from the top down. I heard a lady say one time, I'm just an ordinary member. I said, there's no such animal as an ordinary member. If you're a Christian, you're a great person already declared so by God. You're not ordinary about anything. But time and again, in word and action, Jesus would teach these men in such a way that they must have thought that the world was being turned upside down. We don't understand this. Peter watched him one time washing the feet of his disciples, and Peter said, you're not going to wash my feet. He didn't understand how the master could get down on his knees and get a towel and wash people's feet. And Jesus told him, if I don't wash your feet, you're not going to. He said, wash every part of me. He finally had understood that threat, but I don't know if he understood the idea of being a servant. One of our graduates preaches in a small town in Ridgely, Tennessee. Is that a small town? Yes, I think it is. That congregation had about 15 or 16 members when he went there. I think they average more than that now, about 100. You know what he does? Up until he had his heart attack, he would be out in the community and see somebody digging a ditch. He'd run home and get a shovel and go help the fellow dig a ditch. He was a servant. See somebody painting his house, he'd run and go and help him paint his house. And I thought, that's upside down. Isn't he a preacher? Isn't he supposed to be sitting in his office studying something? He's a servant. It's an interesting thing. It's upside down to me. Jesus told them one time, be forgiving. That was upside down to them. In fact, Peter said, how many times in a day do I have to do that? Everything he was teaching them was upside down. And I'm thinking that we haven't grasped yet quite the concept of being a servant. I think we try to justify our vocations, our faith, the things we buy, our prejudices, which are really sometimes against the upside-down system of God. And it's not at all amusing to hear those 10 just be jealous of what the 2 asked and not think about being what they should be. When I look at Jeffrey and his idea of upside down, and I think about what I am and realize that I serve a God who welcomes me, embraces me, includes me, will I finally get the sense of what it really means to be his follower? How different, how delightful, how equitable everything is when I go by his standard and not waste my time thinking about my needs and my wants and all of my, and I start thinking about you and what you need. And I know that's upside down in our society, but it's the way he taught them on this occasion. I didn't come to be served. But you're the second person of the Godhead in human flesh. You're the power that spoke the world into creation, and you are going to be a servant? And this one who loves me wants me to be just like that. And how often have I come short of that thought? It must have seemed upside down to me too, to be a servant. I think I've told you this before, but one of our students, Marlon Rotana, who is in a preaching school right now in Mexico, teaching, and Marlon said in his last message in chapel, I came here to learn to be a preacher and found out I was supposed to be a servant. That was a big step for him. It was upside down in his mind. The upside down Jesus. I'm a small person, I think. And sometimes I'll do anything to keep one step ahead of somebody else. And I've watched people live their lives that way, trying to keep up with their neighbors or get ahead of their neighbors or make this or do that. I've watched people squeal, whine, connive, weasel, and maneuver their way to the top. And I don't have to go to some other country to see that phenomenon in the one in which I live. I've seen it in school. I've seen it in the workplace. Unfortunately, I've seen it in the church. I've seen it mostly in politics lately. People schmooze their way into a promotion, sweet-talk their way out of trouble, or flirt their way to the top at the expense of those around them. James and John tried to scheme their way to the top, and the 10 were indignant because they wanted to get there too. But Jesus didn't care about their social values or what they had parked in the driveway or how many clothes they had on their backs. That was of little consequence to him. You folks need to learn, he said, I came to be the servant of all, not to be served by all. I want to look at this word servant right here. I did a workbook on the book of Numbers years ago, and this is part of that work, because in the book of Numbers, the key word is warfare or service. It's translated warfare sometimes, but it's servant. And notice, first of all, and I'll invite your attention to John 17:17. If I'm a servant, I need to realize something. I'm a set-apart person. Sanctify them through the truth. Thy word is truth. We are set-apart people. You have a good definition of sanctification in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, or 12. And if you look at verses 2 and 13 of that chapter, is that chapter 12? I can't read it. What chapter have I got there? Chapter 13. I thought I was wrong. That's the first time I've ever made a mistake, too. I can't understand that. Chapter 13, verse 2, he set apart unto me the firstborn. And then in verse 13, set apart those who open the matrix. So you have a good definition of sanctify. Sanctify unto me the firstborn, set apart those. And so sanctification is not holiness. It's simply a word that means when I became a Christian, I had to learn to be different. I think some people rebel against that thought. They don't want to be different. But the Christian, according to what we read there in Mark 10, has to be different from the way the world thinks about what makes them great. My friend Jenny Knox asked me a question one time that has stuck in my mind for years. She said, Keith, if the Lord walked into our assemblies and sat down to the best servant there, by whom would he sit? Of course, I wanted to say he'd sit by me, right? I'd be like James and John in the 10, wouldn't I? I'd already missed the point if I thought I wanted him to sit near me. That's upside down, I know. But that's what he's telling us here. You have to get rid of your own agenda, Keith. Otherwise, you're not like me at all. He did not hold on to heaven. He gave it up to be humiliated. He certainly was set apart for that work. In the E in servant, I used that for the word enthusiastic. This word means God in us, literally. Entheos, God in us. We're enthusiastic. Again, this is Philippians 2 that I've been looking at. God with us served. God in us should make us servants. We have to be enthusiastic, not kicking up your heels. That's not the word. This word has to do with being filled with God. Enthusiastic. We are also to be ready, for every good work. If you'll open your Bible to Titus 3:1, you'll read Paul telling Titus, you teach the brethren to be ready for good works. Without any prompting, I'm ready for good works. They may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven, we're told by the Lord in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:16. And it's also the case that those of us who are servants, who are ready for it, are those who know sometimes I have to give up my time in order to do this. And so we are ready for good works. We are people who are virtuous. I want you to look at Romans 6:17 with me for a moment. I had a public discussion with a well-known brother in Christ on one occasion. And in that particular discussion, he said that the reason you were immersed has no consequence at all. You can be immersed for any reason and still be saved. That's actually legalism, because it leaves out what the Apostle Paul teaches here. He said you obeyed from the heart. You understood exactly what you were doing and why you were doing it, that pattern of teaching, that form of doctrine in the King James. And so when it's the case that I understand what I am and what happened to me when I was baptized, that virtue or courage or strength comes because I understood what I was doing. I counted the cost ahead of time. I became a New Testament Christian. Evan Manning has just returned, he's our associate at Forest Hill, has just returned from a trip to Nepal. And he told about a fellow there who was captured by some Arabian Muslims, and they threatened his life. And it's interesting what that brother said to them. He said, you can take my life, but you can't take my soul, and before I go, let me tell you about Jesus. That is such courage, that's such virtue. He's a servant. He's first of all a servant of Christ. And Evan said something else about these folks. He said they never ask us for a thing over there, and that's one of the poorest country in the world. And they don't ask. They understood that when they were converted, they became servants, and so they don't ask for anything. And evidently don't intend to ask for anything. Notice that next one, adaptable. Paul said in whatever state he was, he learned to be content, to be abased and to abound, to be in want and not to be in want, and so on. He was adaptable. And when I become a Christian, sometimes I have to adapt. I need to be an advocate for those who need help. And adapting means I volunteer my time, my abilities, whatever they be, my money. I volunteer my time to help a child. I volunteer my time to go to the hospitals. Almost monthly, I ask my students a question again and again, and they know why I ask it. Brother Britton, I want you to tell me why they make the announcements on Sunday morning of those that are sick and hurting. What's that all about? Do we make it just because we don't want them to get mad if we don't? Ask yourself why they make those announcements. And then ask yourself, do I intend to go help that person? I might take some of my time and some of my effort. I think I've told you this story before, but it fits right here. A student of mine and I went to visit a brother that was in the hospital, and he was hooked up to every machine they had, I think. And he was taped and things going out of his nose and body. And as we were about to leave, the young man turned to him and said, "Now, sir, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call." We got in the car, and I said, "We're going to go visit his house where he lives. I think his wife's at home at the moment." In fact, I knew she was, but that's what I told him. I said, "I think she's home." So we got there, and I saw the lawnmower there, and I said, "See if that runs, it's got any gas in it." He started it. I said, "Mow his grass for him." And I went and knocked on the door, and I asked her if she needed anything at the grocery store, and she absolutely did, so I went to the grocery store. On the way back to school, after about 2 or 3 hours, he said, "I get it. I get it. I get it." It's upside down. It's just upside down. But we're adaptable. We are nurturing. If we're a servant, we learn to take care of folks. We listen. One of the best listeners I know is going to preach to you in just a moment. He's a trained listener. And several have called me who talked to Glenn and said, "Boy, he really helped me," because he listens. And one of the best things I can do for people is to go and hear their story and listen. And in the story, I'll probably hear something they need, and I'll be able to take care of that. I know that sounds strange to our ears, that we're supposed to be servants, but hold that teddy bear upside down for a while. And finally, he said here that we are to be tireless. We are servants. We're tireless. We're always abounding in the work of the Lord. Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 15, 58. Jesus did not come to serve, but to be served. And he was tireless in doing so. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, because the night comes when no man can work. When will we start being servants? Really and truly. I think I've been on this particular program, how often, Glenn? I don't know. I know Tom Holland and I did it for a while. Long time, right? We're still preaching on being servants. Next year, let's just not have this. Let's just everybody go out and serve. Because all we're doing is sitting here. And there are folks out here, somebody out here might need an umbrella. There's one in my car, just grab it. You get wet if you don't. We have to turn the world upside down, our world, in order to be a servant. In the interest of being a servant, does it seem upside down to you that the second person of the Godhead would serve man? You know, that's upside down with the society in which he lived. Those idolatrous people wanted to be served. In India today, if you make yourself an idol and it doesn't do what you think it should, you just put it on a piece of wood and float it out into the river and set it on fire and float it out in the river. Burn your God and make another one. Because in the world's mind, God is there to serve us. Only. And that's the thing Jesus was trying to turn around when he said, It shall not be so among you. You can't exercise lordship over anyone. You have to be a servant of all. This thought, then, is interesting. They sat way down in front at Knight Arnold in one of the longest auditoriums in the world. That auditorium is about 75 yards long, I think. It's huge. Almost had play football in it. So long. It's not called Knight Arnold anymore, but it was at that time. And they sat down there. Always had great big hats on, Granny and her daughter. And for years, those two, unbeknownst to anyone, would go to the grocery store and buy bags of groceries and set them at the doorway of our students, whom they knew weren't getting very much support in those days, and so they would feed them. And they did that week after week after week. When I did that young lady's funeral at the military burial site there on Jackson and Union in Memphis, I was the only one present. You know what I thought? I wouldn't bother her. She wasn't interested in the applause of men. Had they been, they would have told everybody what they were doing. They were just servants, Granny and her daughter. I leave you with the thought that he gave us. I didn't come to be served, but to serve and give my life a ransom for many. Thank you for your kind attention this morning.